Right now, at this exact moment, there are roughly 1.58 billion cattle alive on Earth. That is one cow for every 5 humans, and every single one of them can trace its ancestry back to a wild animal that no longer exists. An animal so massive and so dangerous that ancient hunters painted its image on cave walls the way we might photograph a lion today. That animal was the oryx, and the decision to tame it, made by a handful of Neolithic farmers over 10,000 years ago in what is now the Middle East, set off a chain of consequences that nobody could have predicted. It reshaped entire continents. It built empires and destroyed forests. It fed billions of people, and according to a growing body of scientific research, became the single most environmentally destructive food that humanity has ever produced. This is the story of beef, and it starts a very long time ago. The oryx was not a cow, or more accurately, the cow had not been invented yet. The aurochs, known to scientists as Bos primigenius, was a wild bovine that roamed across Europe, Asia, and North Africa for roughly 700,000 years. It was the largest land mammal in Europe after the end of the last ice age. Picture an animal that stood nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder, with a thick, muscular neck, a dark coat, and curved horns that could span 3 feet across. Cave paintings at Lascaux in southern France, dating back over 17,000 years, show these animals in stunning detail, captured mid-stride by Paleolithic artists who clearly regarded them with a mixture of awe and fear. And they had reason to be afraid. Aurochs were fast, aggressive, and territorial. Julius Caesar himself described them in his writings about the Germanic tribes, noting that they were nearly as large as elephants and could not be tamed. The Romans hunted them for sport in arena-style spectacles and carved their massive horns into ornate drinking vessels. But somewhere around 10,500 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, a region stretching through modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, something remarkable happened. Early Neolithic farmers, people who were just beginning to figure out how to plant seeds and stay in one place, managed to do what Caesar said was impossible. They domesticated the aurochs, not all at once and not easily. The process probably took centuries. Early farmers likely began by corralling wild aurochs calves, raising them in captivity, and selectively breeding the tamest individuals over many generations. Each generation got slightly smaller, slightly more docile, slightly more useful. The fierce 6 ft wild animal gradually became something a farmer could manage. Genetic evidence now points to at least 2 separate domestication events. The first, around 2,500 years ago, produced humpless taurine cattle in the eastern Mediterranean, the ancestors of most European and American breeds today. The second, roughly 1,500 years later, produced humped zebu cattle in the Indus Valley of modern-day Pakistan and India, the ancestors of the hardy breeds that now thrive across tropical Asia and Africa. Both descend from that same wild ancestor. Both would go on to transform the world. A geneticist once described the relationship between domestic cattle and the aurochs this way. Today's cattle are aurochs, basically, but to the same degree that a poodle is a wolf. And as for the aurochs itself, domestication was part of what killed it. As farming spread, the aurochs lost its habitat. Domesticated cattle competed for the same grasslands. Hunters kept taking their toll. The population shrank across centuries until, by the 1500s, the only wild aurochs left on Earth lived in a single forest in central Poland, protected by royal decree. In 1599, just 24 remained. By 1620, the last bull was dead. And on a day in 1627 in the Oktorov forest near Warsaw, the final aurochs, a lone female, died of natural causes. The species that gave us every cow on Earth was gone, but the animal it left behind was just getting started. In the ancient world, cattle were far more than food. In Mesopotamia, they pulled plows and turned irrigation wheels, making large-scale agriculture possible for the first time. In ancient Egypt, cattle were associated with the goddess Hathor and depicted constantly in tomb paintings and temple carvings. Owning cattle was a sign of wealth and divine favor. Beef was eaten primarily by priests, pharaohs, and the upper classes. For ordinary Egyptians, it was a rare luxury reserved for festivals and religious ceremonies. In ancient Rome, beef occupied a complicated space. The Romans ate enormous quantities of meat, but they actually preferred pork. Cattle were considered more valuable alive as draft animals for farming and transport than dead on a plate. Sacrificing a bull to the gods was among the most significant religious acts in Roman society. The suavitaurilia, a ritual sacrifice of a pig, a sheep, and a bull, was performed to purify Roman armies before battle and to bless new farmland. You did not casually slaughter something that valuable just for dinner. Beef was reserved for feasts, for celebrations, for moments that mattered. Meanwhile, in the Indus Valley and later across the Indian subcontinent, cattle took on an entirely different significance. Hinduism elevated the cow to sacred status, a living symbol of abundance, motherhood, and nonviolence. India would eventually become home to the largest cattle population on Earth, over 300 million animals, the vast majority of which are never slaughtered for meat. That single cultural decision, replicated across centuries, shaped the agricultural landscape of an entire continent. Across the ancient world, the pattern held. Cattle meant power, cattle meant status, and in many cultures, cattle literally meant money. The English word capital shares a root with the Latin word for cattle. So does chattel, meaning property. In East Africa, the Maasai measured a family's standing by the size of its herd. The connection between cows and wealth was so deeply embedded in human civilization that it shaped the very language we still use today. As the Roman Empire fell and medieval Europe took shape, cattle spread across the continent alongside farming communities. Breeds diversified as different regions selected for different traits. English farmers bred cattle for dairy. French and Italian farmers bred dual-purpose animals for both milk and meat. Spanish ranchers bred them for hardiness and endurance on the dry Iberian plains. And it was those Spanish cattle that would eventually cross an ocean and change the course of history on two continents. When Christopher Columbus sailed to the Americas in 1493 on his second voyage, he brought cattle with him. It was one of the most consequential cargo decisions in history. Spanish settlers continued importing livestock throughout the 1500s, establishing herds across the Caribbean islands, Mexico, Central America, and what would eventually become the American Southwest. These were tough, lean animals bred for survival in harsh conditions. Many of them escaped or were released, going feral across the open grasslands of a continent that had never seen a hoofed grazing animal of this size. The native grasslands of the Americas had evolved without large domestic herbivores, and the ecological impact was immediate. Cattle competed with native species for forage. Their hooves compacted soil that had never been trampled in this way. Grassland ecosystems that had developed over millennia began to shift. Over the next 3 centuries, these feral herds, mixed with later English breeds brought by colonists along the eastern seaboard, became the foundation of the American cattle industry. The Texas Longhorn, one of the most iconic symbols of the American West, traces its lineage directly back to those Spanish imports from the late 1400s. But for most of this history, beef remained expensive and logistically difficult. You could not move a dead cow very far before it spoiled. You could move a live cow, but slowly and at great cost. Fresh beef was local, seasonal, and still out of reach for most ordinary people. In cities like New York and Philadelphia, butchers sourced cattle from nearby farms and slaughtered them on site. There was no national supply chain, no cold storage, no way to get a steak from Texas to a dinner table in Boston. What changed everything was the same force that changed everything else in the 1800s: industry. The American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, disrupted farming across the South and created massive demand for meat in the North. Meanwhile, Texas had been left largely untouched by the fighting, and millions of cattle roamed its open ranges. When the war ended, a steer worth $4 in Texas could sell for $40 in Kansas. That tenfold price gap created one of the most romanticized chapters in American history, the era of the cowboy and the great cattle drives. Starting in 1867, cowboys drove enormous herds north from Texas along trails like the Chisholm Trail, heading for railroad towns in Kansas like Abilene and Dodge City. A livestock dealer named Joseph McCoy built the stockyards in Abilene specifically to serve as the junction between the cattle trails and the Kansas Pacific Railway. Between 1867 and 1881, more than 2 million cattle were shipped from Abilene to Chicago alone. These drives were brutal work. Cowboys earned low wages, slept in the open, and faced threats from river crossings, stampedes, and hostile weather. Many of them were former Civil War veterans. A significant number were black men who had been enslaved on southern ranches and used their knowledge of livestock to find work on the frontier. Others were Mexican vaqueros, whose horsemanship and cattle handling techniques had shaped ranching culture long before the word cowboy existed. But the era of the open range was short. In 1873, a farmer named Joseph Glidden patented barbed wire, and thousands of miles of it soon crisscrossed the Great Plains, carving up open grassland into fenced homesteads and making long-distance cattle drives impossible. The cowboys became obsolete within a generation, but the industry they had built, connecting western cattle ranges with eastern cities, was only getting bigger. The real transformation, though, happened not on the trail, but on the rails. In 1869, a Chicago meatpacker named G.H. Hammond shipped slaughtered beef from Chicago to Boston in an air-cooled railroad car. Within a decade, a businessman named Gustavus Swift perfected the refrigerated railroad car, and suddenly everything changed. You no longer needed to ship live cattle across the country, watching them lose weight and die along the way. You could slaughter them in Chicago, pack the meat in ice, and send it anywhere. Beef went from a regional product to a national commodity almost overnight. Chicago became the center of it all. The Union stockyards, which opened on Christmas Day in 1865, grew into a square mile of livestock pens, slaughterhouses, and processing plants. At its peak, the stockyards processed 18 million animals per year. The meatpacking empires of Swift, Armour, Hammond, and Morris dominated the industry. By 1890, these four companies controlled virtually every aspect of the American beef supply chain. By the turn of the 20th century, meatpacking was America's biggest industry, generating over $1 billion in annual sales, more than the entire annual budget of the United States government at the time. But speed and scale came at a cost. Working conditions inside the packing plants were appalling. Workers stood in blood and animal waste for 12-hour shifts. Injuries were common and often ignored. The meat itself was handled under conditions that, by modern standards, are genuinely difficult to describe without turning your stomach. In 1904, a 26-year-old journalist and socialist named Upton Sinclair boarded a train to Chicago in search of material for what he hoped would be the great American novel. He spent 7 weeks undercover inside the meatpacking district, walking the killing floors, watching immigrant workers operate in conditions that were dangerous, degrading, and sometimes fatal. The result was a novel called The Jungle, published in 1906, which told the fictional story of a Lithuanian immigrant named Jurgis Rudkus and his family as they were chewed up by the meatpacking machine. Sinclair had intended the book as a socialist argument about how immigrant workers were being exploited. He wrote about injuries that went untreated, wages that could not cover rent, and families destroyed by a system designed to extract every last ounce of labor from people who had no other options. But the public barely noticed the labor story. Instead, they fixated on the passages describing what was happening to the meat. Rotten beef treated with chemicals to mask the smell, rat droppings mixed into sausage, workers handling meat with hands covered in open sores. The newspaper headlines were not about worker exploitation. They were about what America was eating for dinner. The outcry was immediate and massive. President Theodore Roosevelt ordered an independent investigation, which confirmed nearly everything Sinclair had written. On June 30th, 1906, Roosevelt signed both the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act into law, creating the legal foundation for food safety regulation that still exists in the United States today. Sinclair later said, with some bitterness, that he had aimed for the public's heart and hit its stomach instead. The new regulations cleaned up the worst of the abuses, but they did nothing to slow the industry's growth. If anything, government oversight gave consumers more confidence, and demand kept climbing. The 20th century saw beef transform from an industrial commodity into a cultural icon. The hamburger, which had been a novelty at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, became the centerpiece of a new kind of American dining. White Castle opened in Wichita, Kansas in 1921, selling small square burgers for 5 cents apiece and proving that beef could be fast, cheap, and endlessly repeatable. McDonald's followed in San Bernardino, California in 1940, and by the 1950s, the fast food hamburger had become synonymous with American life itself. Drive-through windows and neon signs stretched across every highway in the country. The American love affair with beef, which had been growing since the cattle drives, was now a full-blown national obsession. Per capita beef consumption in the United States peaked in the 1970s at over 90 lb per person per year. To feed this growing appetite, the beef industry reinvented itself again. The old model of open-range grazing gave way to something completely different: the concentrated animal feeding operation, or CAFO. Instead of cattle roaming across grasslands, they were packed into feedlots, sometimes tens of thousands of animals on a single muddy property, and fed a carefully calculated diet of corn, soy, and growth supplements designed to put weight on them as fast as possible. A steer that might take 4 or 5 years to reach market weight on grass could now be ready in 14 to 16 months on grain. The economics were irresistible: more beef, faster, cheaper. At the same time, the industry consolidated. Small local slaughterhouses gave way to massive processing plants run by a handful of corporations. Today, just 4 companies control the majority of beef processing in the United States. Globally, the Brazilian meatpacker JBS is the largest meat company on earth, processing millions of cattle per year across operations in Brazil, the United States, Australia, and beyond. The scale of modern beef production is genuinely difficult to comprehend without numbers that sound made up. But feedlots were also, by almost any ecological measure, a disaster. The concentration of waste from thousands of animals in a small area created massive pollution problems. Runoff from feedlots contaminated rivers and groundwater with nitrogen and phosphorus. The antibiotics fed to cattle to keep them healthy in crowded conditions contributed to the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And the sheer volume of grain required to feed these animals meant that enormous tracts of farmland were being used not to grow food for people, but to grow food for cows. That last point deserves a closer look because the numbers are staggering. According to data compiled from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and published by Our World in Data, livestock accounts for roughly 77% of all agricultural land on the planet. That includes pastures for grazing and cropland used to grow animal feed. But despite using more than 3/4 of all farmland, livestock produces only about 18% of the world's calories and 37% of its protein. The land used for livestock globally is roughly the size of the entire Americas, North and South combined. And within that enormous footprint, beef is by far the worst offender. A single kilogram of beef requires approximately 15,400 L of water to produce. That is the equivalent of roughly 100 full bathtubs. The same kilogram generates about 99 kg of greenhouse gas emissions measured in carbon dioxide equivalents. To put that in perspective, burning a kilogram of coal, one of the dirtiest fossil fuels on Earth, produces about 2 kg of greenhouse gas. Kilogram for kilogram, beef produces roughly 50 times the emissions of coal. Chicken, by comparison, produces about 1/10 the emissions of beef for the same amount of protein. Lentils produce about 1/30. The single biggest driver of beef's climate impact is methane. Cattle are ruminants, meaning they digest food through a process of fermentation in their stomachs that produces methane as a byproduct. They release it primarily through burping. Methane is over a 20-year time frame, about 86 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. The methane from cattle digestion alone accounts for roughly 40% of beef's total carbon footprint. Feed production, including the fertilizers, irrigation, and machinery needed to grow corn and soy for cattle, accounts for another 25%, and land use change, meaning the forests cut down to make room for pastures and feed crops, adds another 20%. Nowhere is that land use change more visible or more devastating than in the Amazon rainforest. Cattle ranching is responsible for an estimated 70% of all deforestation in the Amazon basin. The World Resources Institute found that beef production drives roughly 41% of tropical deforestation globally, the equivalent of about 2.1 million hectares lost every year, an area roughly half the size of the Netherlands. In Brazil, over 800 million trees were felled between 2017 and 2022 for the nation's beef industry alone. Brazil is the world's largest exporter of beef and its cattle herd of roughly 194 million animals is the second largest on Earth after India's. The connection between beef and the Amazon is not subtle. It is direct, documented, and ongoing. The process works like this. Ranchers, sometimes legally and sometimes not, clear sections of rainforest by cutting and burning the trees. The cleared land is converted to cattle pasture. The cattle graze for a few years until the thin tropical soil is exhausted, and then the ranchers move deeper into the forest and clear more. The beef is processed by major meat packers like JBS, the world's largest meat company, and exported to markets across the globe, including the United States, China, and Europe. Investigations have repeatedly found cattle being raised on illegally deforested land, including land belonging to indigenous communities, laundered through intermediary ranches, and sold to processors who then market the beef as deforestation-free. The Amazon, which has historically served as one of the planet's great carbon sinks, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in plant matter, has now been pushed to a point where large sections are emitting more carbon than they absorb. Scientists describe this as a tipping point, beyond which the forest may not recover. And the Amazon is not the only ecosystem under pressure. The Cerrado, a vast tropical savanna in central Brazil that is one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth, has lost roughly half its native vegetation, largely to cattle ranching and soy production for animal feed. In the United States, the Great Plains, once home to massive herds of bison and complex prairie ecosystems, were converted almost entirely to cattle ranching and feed crop agriculture over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Globally, the expansion of beef production has been linked to habitat loss, affecting thousands of species. Of the 28,000 species currently listed as threatened with extinction on the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List, agriculture is identified as a threat for 24,000 of them, and beef production is the largest single driver within that category. The scale of the global cattle industry today would be unrecognizable to anyone from even 100 years ago. There are approximately 1.58 billion cattle alive on the planet as of 2024. That number has grown from about 942 million in 1961, driven by rising demand in developing countries, population growth, and the expansion of fast food culture worldwide. The United States alone produces over 12 million metric tons of beef per year, making it the world's largest producer. The global industry generates hundreds of billions of dollars annually and employs tens of millions of people, from ranchers and feedlot workers to meat packers and truck drivers, which is exactly what makes this problem so difficult. Beef is not just a food, it is an industry, an identity, and for many communities around the world, a way of life. In Argentina, the asado is a cultural institution. In the American West, cattle ranching is woven into regional identity in ways that go far deeper than economics. In parts of East Africa and South Asia, cattle remain a primary store of wealth and a marker of social standing, much as they were in ancient Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. Telling people to eat less beef is not like telling them to switch brands of toothpaste. It touches on culture, tradition, livelihood, and personal freedom in ways that make it one of the most emotionally charged conversations in the entire climate debate. But the numbers are what they are. Livestock production contributes roughly 14% to 15% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. For comparison, the entire United States, every car, factory, power plant, and building in the country accounts for about 10% to 11% of global emissions. The math does not change because the subject is uncomfortable. There are people working on solutions, and some of them are genuinely promising. Researchers at institutions around the world are experimenting with feed additives, including a compound derived from red seaweed, that can reduce methane emissions from cattle by up to 80% in controlled trials. If these additives could be deployed at scale across the global herd, the impact on emissions would be significant. Regenerative grazing practices, where cattle are rotated across pastures in ways that mimic the movement patterns of wild herds, show promise for restoring soil health and sequestering carbon. Advocates argue that well-managed grazing can actually turn cattle into a net positive for grassland ecosystems. Critics point out that the evidence on net climate impact at scale is still thin, and that regenerative grazing requires far more land per animal than feedlots, which brings its own set of trade-offs. Lab-grown meat, also called cultivated meat, has progressed from a $330,000 proof-of-concept burger in 2013 to products that have received regulatory approval in the United States, Singapore, and other countries. Whether consumers will adopt it widely remains an open question. Plant-based alternatives from companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods carved out a growing share of the market in the early 2020s, though sales growth has since slowed as the novelty wore off and some consumers returned to conventional beef. None of these solutions has yet reached the scale needed to fundamentally alter the trajectory. Global beef consumption continues to rise, driven largely by growing demand in China, Brazil, and other rapidly developing economies. The FAO has projected that global meat production could double by 2050 if current trends continue. Whether the planet can absorb that increase is a question that the scientific community has answered fairly clearly. It cannot. Not without consequences that will be measured in lost forests, lost species, and a warmer, less stable climate. 10,500 years ago, a handful of farmers in the Fertile Crescent looked at a wild animal the size of a small car and decided they could bend it to their will. In a sense, they were right. The aurochs is gone, but its descendants number in the billions. They have been bred into over 1,000 distinct varieties, from compact dairy cows in the Netherlands to massive Wagyu cattle in Japan. They occupy more land than any other domesticated animal on Earth. They feed more people than any single crop except rice and wheat. They are, by almost any measure, one of the most successful experiments in the history of human civilization. But success has a price, and the bill for this particular experiment is coming due. In deforested rainforests and methane-saturated skies and rivers choked with agricultural runoff, the history of beef is, in many ways, the history of human ambition itself. We saw something wild, we claimed it, we scaled it up far beyond anything nature intended, and now we are starting to reckon with what that scaling cost. The question is not really whether beef is destructive. The science on that is settled. The question is what we are willing to do about it.